Good evening, and thank you, Michelle, for having me here, inviting me to meet all your friends of science. It's really an honor to be here and give yourselves a hand for all of the support that you give to science. I'm here today to talk about an important example of the failed science that's used to convince uninformed people that burning fossil fuels has had and will continue to have a harmful effect on the planet. Since the start of this century, polar bears have been an icon for all that's worrisome about human-caused global warming and declining sea ice. In the year 2000, Time magazine proclaimed that the coming Arctic meltdown due to global warming put polar bears, and all of us, in danger. By 2006, Time told us that global warming was damaging to the planet at an alarming rate, and we should all be very worried. From that time onward, virtually any news story about global warming, whether it was about polar bears or not, featured a winsome photo of cute cubs or a struggling bear. The polar bear had become one of the most recognizable icons for global warming. There have been concerns about polar bear survival for so long it's probably impossible for most people to remember when it started and why. The Polar Bear Specialist Group was created in 1968 as a unit of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, who had just developed a red list of threatened and endangered species. The PBSG negotiated the 1973 International Treaty to protect polar bears from unregulated hunting, a very real threat they'd been subjected to for almost a century. In 1982, polar bears were listed as vulnerable, a category equivalent to threatened in the US system. They remained in that category until 1996, when it became clear that polar bear numbers had recovered substantially. Due to the population rebound, polar bear status changed to lower risk in 1996, now known as least concern, and it remained there for 10 years. Polar bears had been saved. However, Polar Bear Specialist Group members were clearly not happy that polar bears no longer qualified as vulnerable. In 2006, the group recommended that polar bears be uplisted back to vulnerable on the red list based on population declines they thought might happen if global warming models turned out to be correct. This decision was not supported by detailed scientific analysis by polar bear specialists. It was simply a guess. Yet, this was the very first time that future threats based on climate models had been used to declare a species threatened with extinction by the red list folks or anyone else. Ironically, the same year, the common hippo was also listed as vulnerable based on an actual decline of more than 95% in the Congo. Two species, same red list conservation status, one based on fact, one on conjecture. One reason behind the PBSG decision to uplist polar bears to the vulnerable category was undoubtedly the knowledge that in early 2005, 3 activist environmental groups, the Center for Biological Diversity, Greenpeace, and Natural Resources Defense Council, filed a petition to list polar bears as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, the ESA, in the US. Later that year, the group sued the US government for failing to address their concerns within the time frame required by the ESA. By 2007, American biologists at the US Geological Survey, the USGS, used a similar modeled future threats strategy to support the prediction that polar bears would be threatened with extinction within 45 years due to sea ice loss caused by global warming. USGS biologists predicted that most of the world's polar bears would be gone by 2050 and virtually extinct by the end of the century. Their models were based on one particular biologist's opinion of how polar bears would respond to projected summer sea ice changes. That biologist's name was Stephen Amstrup, and he was head of polar bear research at the USGS at the time. He and his colleagues focused on summer sea ice because spring, fall, and winter ice models showed no significant change by mid-century, but summer sea ice projections showed a dramatic decline. This emphasis forced summer to become the critical season for predicting the future of polar bears. Predictably, by 2008, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service accepted the USGS assessment and declared polar bears threatened under the ESA. The news traveled fast. Polar bears were doomed. So here's what the summer sea ice projections looked like. The USGS polar bear projection is on the left, the sea ice that they anticipated would be present in the year 2050. And the prediction from sea ice experts is on the right. It's a little difficult to see, but they are virtually identical in extent. And this is what the polar bear experts said would happen. In essence, that rapid sea ice decline would cause a rapid polar bear population decline. 2/3 of the world's polar bears would disappear when sea ice declined about 42% from 1979 levels. That meant all of the bears in Hudson Bay, Alaska, Russia, and Norway, as well as the bears off Labrador, were expected to be gone entirely. What they meant was that by 2050, summer sea ice was expected to drop below 5 million kilometers squared in 8 out of 10 years, and when it did, the global population of polar bears was predicted to fall from about 24,500 to only 8,100. And this is a map of what the USGS called sea ice ecoregions that it used for their predictions. It groups areas of the Arctic according to similar sea ice types. And if you look at this map, what their predictions meant was that all of the bears in the purple and green areas were expected to disappear as a consequence of that dramatic sea ice decline. 10 entire subpopulations predicted to be gone. Unfortunately for the modelers, summer sea ice unexpectedly dropped in 2007 to the level not predicted to occur until mid-century. This slide shows the summer minimum extent in 2007, the panel on the left. The panel on the right is a USGS graph that shows the 2007 extent marked with a vertical red line, and that it was lower than any of the 5 best sea ice models predicted for 2050. In other words, the authors knew, even before the ink was dry on their report, that the sea ice reality was trouble for their prediction. And it was indeed trouble. With the exception of 2 years, when the September minimum was slightly above 5 million kilometers squared, sea ice has remained at 2050 levels since 2007. And here's 2016, and in fact, if you added 2017 and 2018, they would fit in that model as well. In other words, the dreaded mid-century sea ice levels had arrived decades before they were expected. But USGS biologists kept their mouths closed and hoped no one would notice. And no one did, until I made the connection in 2015. What I noticed was that the predicted sea ice levels had already happened, but the polar bear catastrophe hadn't. And you can see from this September sea ice graph that sea ice levels dropped suddenly and dramatically in 2007. That's the point just after the blue arrow on the graph, and stayed low ever after. The blue arrow on the graph is marking the point at 2005. But the global polar bear population did not decline. In fact, it grew from about 24,500 to about 28,500 in 2015. A 16% increase despite the sudden and dramatic sea ice loss. Contrary to predictions, not a single subpopulation was wiped out. Only one conclusion could be drawn. The sea ice tanked, but polar bears thrived. Or more simply, the models were spectacularly wrong. What we ended up with was nearly 50% loss of sea ice and very fat bears. So why were the models so wrong? It turned out, for one thing, that polar bears eat little during the summer, regardless of changes in sea ice extent, simply because seals are hard to catch at that time of year, and that was something that was not considered in their models. As well, ringed and bearded seals, the primary prey of polar bears, do better with a longer open water season in summer because they have more time to feed. Fat and healthy pregnant seals mean more fat pups the following spring for polar bears to eat. And also, ice conditions in early spring have continued to be good for both seals and bears, which is important because spring is when both seals and bears really need the ice the most. And lastly, none of the predictive models included a provision for the population size effects of periodic thick spring ice conditions, such as occur in the southern Beaufort Sea every 10 years or so. And what about those high-risk subpopulations that were predicted to be gone when sea ice levels declined? In fact, we now have recent data from 3 regions within the so-called seasonal ice ecoregions, marked in green on this map, that show how the bears have fared with low summer ice. Now, the seasonal ice area is when the ice disappears entirely and the bears move onshore and spend the summer on land. For example, all 3 of the subpopulation in Hudson's Bay have been surveyed recently and found to be stable or declined only slightly. Records also show the shift to a longer ice-free season happened around 1998. Breakup and freeze-up dates for Western Hudson Bay have been variable since then, but with no further decline in ice cover. The Davis Strait subpopulation has been increasing over the last 2 decades, a trend likely to continue due to the abundance of harp seals and their young for the bears to eat in the critical spring feeding period. And that's primarily on the cancellation of the harp seal hunt off of Newfoundland and Labrador. And in Baffin Bay, a recent study showed that by 2013, bear numbers had increased 36% over previous survey estimates, despite the declining sea ice. And if we moved into the so-called divergent ecoregion that make up most of Russia and the end part of Alaska, marked in purple on this map, we have recent data on 4 subpopulations. Chukchi Sea polar bears were found to be in better health and reproducing better after 2007 than they had been in the 1980s, despite much less summer ice in recent years. And in the Kara Sea, off eastern Russia, about 3,200 bears were counted in 2013, the first survey that had ever been conducted there. That was a much higher number than the 2005 ballpark estimate of about 2,000 used by USGS biologists in their models. The Barents Sea, north of Norway, increased 42% between 2004 and 2015, based on a survey of half the region. And despite a fairly recent population count, the southern Beaufort subpopulation cannot be used to make any generalizations about polar bears, because well-documented episodes of thick spring ice happen routinely in this region. The population size fluctuates up and down naturally over time. So overall, most bears in a number of subpopulations deemed to be most at risk to a loss of summer sea ice were found to be fat and healthy. For example, triplet litters have always been rare outside Western Hudson Bay, yet the photo on the left shows a set of 5 fat 9-month-old triplets photographed in the southern Beaufort Sea in the summer of 2016, a year when bears spent about 4 more weeks on shore than they had done in the 1980s. The photo on the right shows a litter of 1.5-year-old triplet cubs with their mother in the Chukchi Sea during the spring of 2010. after the region had experienced several years of much longer than average open water in summer. In other words, when conditions are good, more females than usual are able to raise triplets until they are weaned. And despite the rhetoric from polar bear specialists and the media, good conditions now exist in many parts of the Arctic. I've written up my scientific argument showing how and why the USGS prediction was spectacularly wrong and presented it in a scientific paper. The title of this was Testing the Hypothesis that Routine Sea Ice Coverage of 3 to 5 million kilometers squared results in a greater than 30% decline in population size of polar bears. Really boring. But this is how we do it. It's how we're supposed to do it. And I presented this as an exercise in testing the original US hypothesis, because that's how proper science is done. You don't have to put a collar on a polar bear to assess whether a prediction published in 2007 matches up with documented observations in 2015, because the information necessary is all available in published documents. However, a few months later, I woke up to find this paper hitting media outlets worldwide. A paper called International Blogs, Polar Bears and Climate Change Denial by Proxy. Of the 14 co-authors listed on this paper, I'd only heard of 5 of them. 2 of them were polar bear specialists. One was Ian Sterling, the other was Stephen Amstrup, who's now at Polar Bears International. And another one was Michael Mann, a climate scientist. Why he was on that list, I really don't know. Newspapers worldwide carried the story. My daughter-in-law's brother emailed me to say a story about me was in his local paper in Germany and what was going on. Newspapers in my hometown in Victoria, BC also carried the story. Some of them got very inventive about the titles of their pieces. One of them was nearly all climate change denial blogs quote exactly the same deep, dubious research. And another one, polar bear blogs denying climate change are being used to spread conspiracy theories around the globe. There was a press release issued by Polar Bears International, where co-author Stephen Amstrup now works, that talked about a climate change denial machine. And as late as April 2018, there was this one from the New York Times. Climate change denialists say polar bears are fine. Scientists are pushing back. Now, this was an attempt to silence legitimate scientific criticism. Jeff Harvey, who's the lead author of this paper, and his colleagues attacked my blog, my reports, my credentials, and my integrity, along with any blog or news outlet or anyone who had ever quoted any work that I had done. What they didn't do was address the issues raised in my paper. But it turned out all the attention they got from the media backfired. Views of my blog went through the roof. Readers donated funds to support me, and downloads of my scientific paper pushed it to one of the top 5 papers in the server by the end of 2017. And it has now been downloaded more than 3,500 times. Now, many people still harp about the fact that the paper was not officially peer-reviewed by the organization that published it. But here is what an anonymous colleague of a very outspoken polar bear specialist told me, and he wishes to remain anonymous, but he came across my paper and decided to read it. And he said, the first thing I noticed was the message, non-peer-reviewed, stamped right across the top of the paper. Except he read it anyway. And then he said, I can imagine why. You are probably not popular among polar bear scientists these days. If they would review your article, they probably would do everything to stop it. And in fact, they did. Nevertheless, I really liked your very detailed and concise analysis of the predictions about a polar bear population crash as a result of diminished sea ice that never happened. You also come up with explanations. Bears are much better at fasting than assumed, and their prey benefits from less summer sea ice. For me, this was all a bit shocking, he said. Polar bear scientists don't want to discuss and debate your review using solid scientific arguments, but they use the strategy of ignoring you. That is unethical, unscientific, and highly unfair. To me, your analyses seem very thorough and is convincing. I think you are very, very brave to write this paper. So let's move on to an issue that I have addressed in my new book that I really haven't addressed elsewhere. And that's the issue of how many polar bears are really out there. Because one of the things that has happened is that the Polar Bear Specialist Group has really been continually lowballing the estimates of how many bears are in the Arctic and saying, you know, we don't have estimates from some areas, some are out of date, and so they really are giving the impression that polar bear numbers have not changed very much over the last couple of decades. But we now have population size estimate from the Chukchi Sea, for example, that can be extrapolated to estimate the current population size of bears in the Laptev Sea in Russia, where there has been no estimate. As well, we have population estimates from Kane Basin that can be used to update other subpopulation counts in the Canadian Arctic. This gives us a way to generate a much more plausible estimate rather than the lowball numbers the PSG have been pushing for so many years. And this is my plausible scientific estimate. Around 39,000 with a range of 26,000 to 58,000 for the global population. Now, this graph shows the sea ice extent again for September since 1979, and what I'm going to do is plot the polar bear population estimates against it. Again, the blue arrow marks 2005. So if we start from a plausible benchmark estimate of about 10,000 bears at 1960, and that's the dot in the lower left corner of the graph, then what we've got is that number rose to about 25,000 in 1993. And what the polar bear experts at the PBSG would like you to believe is that that global size has stayed about the same ever since. However, my estimate of about 39,000 at 2018 suggests the population has probably continued to grow as it had been doing since 1960, despite the recent decline of summer sea ice. This really shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone. It's what populations of marine mammals do when unregulated hunting is stopped. Sea otter and humpback whale numbers, for example, rebounded even more spectacularly than this. And what should also not be a surprise is that having 4 to 6 times as many polar bears as there were in the 1960s is already having an impact on Arctic residents. Last summer, 2 Inuit hunters were killed in predatory attacks by bears. Bears also destroy property. Bears are now a danger year-round, and they can be found on shore at any time of year, even though polar bear specialists assume that most bears are on the ice from fall through early summer. For example, from January to March in southern Labrador in the last few years, there's been numerous sightings of polar bears when they should have been out on the ice. And then in the lower right-hand corner in Arviat in the Hudson Bay, There's been bears coming to visit their town dump in April when they should be feeding out on the ice. And in some cases, there has been females with newborn cubs spotted in Arviat, which seems to be a new phenomenon. And lastly, we have the most recent spectacular event from coastal Russia of more than 50 bears terrorizing a town in western Russia in February of 2019. In addition, in 2013, there was a near fatal mauling of a tourist in northern Labrador by a large male polar bear in good condition. He wasn't starving. And from March to May 2017, more than a dozen bears came ashore in Newfoundland, where they found property to destroy. And in August 2018, an adult female in good condition with a cub at her side killed an Inuk hunter from Fox Basin. This may have been the first documented case of a female with cubs initiating a predatory attack. Several more bears were attracted by the carnage. There was not much sea ice at the time. A lack of sea ice was not an issue here, and in fact there was so much sea ice that the survivors had to wait 3 days to be rescued. So let me just summarize the points that I've made. Summer sea ice is not crucial for polar bear health and survival. Less ice in summer is beneficial to ringed and bearded seals, the primary prey of polar bears. And since 2005, even though sea ice dropped to levels not predicted to occur until 2050, polar bear numbers did not plummet as expected. Polar bear populations are now the highest they've been in 50 years. And since 2005, polar bear specialists have repeatedly underestimated the global population size. A plausible global population number is probably about 39,000, with a range of 26,000 to 58,000. And lastly, thriving polar bear populations put the safety of Arctic residents at risk. And these are the books I brought for sale today. If they've sold out, all are available through Amazon, but they'll still be available through the break and when we're done until they sold out. My latest book, The Polar Bear Catastrophe That Never Happened, is we had our launch this afternoon, and the Polar Bear Facts and Myths is my polar bear book for children, and it's aimed at kids age 7 and up. And Eaton is my polar bear attack thriller that is almost guaranteed to give you nightmares. And in fact, it gave me nightmares to write it. And all I can say in closing is that it's been an uphill climb, but the truth is finally coming out, and I really thank you for your attention and for all your support. Thank you.